Here we're going to look at optics in Photoshop's Camera Raw, which is called lens corrections in Lightroom, but they operate in exactly the same way in both programs. In any image editing software you would care to name or use, our workflow remains the same. It's generally a series of small steps. Each one of them builds up to sometimes a significant change for the better in our final image. Optics in Adobe Camera Raw, lens corrections in Lightroom should be one of the first of those steps. When we open up the optics in Camera Raw or lens corrections in Lightroom, we'll see there's two types of change we can make: chromatic aberration and profile corrections. Both of these have an automatic and a manual setting. Let's begin with chromatic aberration. You can Google the cause of this chromatic aberration if you wish, but I'm more interested in how we can fix it. When we look at an image like this, it looks perfectly okay. It's opened up into Camera Raw and no changes have yet been made. But let's take a closer look by zooming in to maybe the edge of that curve. I'm going to click and drag to do that, and when I get this image large on screen, we can quite clearly see that we've got a bad case of chromatic aberration. The coloured fringing we see alongside sometimes light areas against darker backgrounds. How do we fix it? 99 times out of 100, all it's going to take is for us to put a little tick in that box over on the right hand side, remove chromatic aberration. Now it's pretty essential we do this. Let me show you why. Because if later on in our manipulations here we go to the Basic tab and we want to increase the vibrance and or the saturation, you can quite clearly see that we make a bad situation considerably worse. So allow me to double click these sliders to reset that colour, and we'll go back to our optics. Because if I just, let's come up a little bit bigger, if we take a look at the chromatic aberration and we tick the box, it does a pretty good job. 99 times out of 100, that's going to meet all of your needs. And when I right click and fit this in view, I'd be quite happy here to proceed with the rest of my manipulation. Now, as you can see here, I've opened up a different image into Adobe Camera Raw. My experience tells me that practically all of my images I'll see chromatic aberration, and I've grown so confident in the remove chromatic aberration little box on the right hand side that I tend to tick the box and move on. Sometimes I don't even do what I'm about to do here, and that's to zoom in and take a look. But when I do, as you can see there quite clearly, we've got the cyan fringing down the right hand side of that branch and others, and the magenta down the other side. But if we go over to the remove chromatic aberration, and this image is well over 400% enlarged, when I tick the box, it's removed completely. And much the same as the previous image, if I right click and fit this image back in view, I'd be quite happy to continue my manipulations from here, knowing I'm not going to make that chromatic aberration worse. As you can see here, I've opened up my original image and I've reset all of the Camera Raw settings back to default. So if I click and drag over the same location as before, we see the chromatic aberration just as we saw before. So let's go to the options in the optics and I'll tick the box to remove chromatic aberration. Now in the vast majority of cases, I think that correction is going to meet all of our needs, but there are some rare cases where we still see some chromatic aberration, and there are ways we can try to get it marginally better. If we go down to the Defringe option and drop down the little panel, there's a couple of options here. If we look at the strongest magenta down the edge there, if you keep your eye around this area here, if I drop the purple slider down, you can see that that does a pretty good job. So there's one method. I'll double click and reset that. We could do the same with the greens. Let me have a go at that by dropping the green amount right the way down. And that has a pretty good effect too. But we also have the eyedropper tool here. And when I select it and move on to the picture surface, you can see the icon changes to the eyedropper. So the idea here is to select the strongest colors and click on them and give Adobe Camera Raw a chance to put in the fix. So where's the strongest magenta? Somewhere around there. So I'm going to carefully click in that position, and you can see it's done a remarkably good job. While we're on a little bit of a roll here, well, let's do the same with the green. I think this area up here is the strongest. Now sometimes if we click on an area, we'll get this little warning panel appear. The area we've clicked is too neutral to set the defringe color. So please check on a more colorful area. So I suppose we can take two things from this. Either that's exactly what we've got to do, and if there's a stronger green somewhere, we can click on that. But if there isn't, then it's basically telling us we've probably got it as good as we're likely to get. But if you remember a few moments ago when I dropped that green amount slider down to the right, we seem to get rid of most of the green, if not all. So we can combine part automatic and part manual. So if I drop my green slider down, I think we've got a result there that we could all live with. And we mustn't lose sight of the fact that we've got this image zoomed to 500%. So if there's going to be any chromatic aberration, we're certainly going to see it at that size. Control 0 will fit my image back on screen. And as usual, at this sort of size, we don't see chromatic aberration, but now we've got the confidence that there isn't any. Every image we shoot is going to be unique, and therefore chromatic aberration is going to vary. In most cases, just ticking the remove chromatic aberration is going to meet all of our needs. Whenever you need to use the defringe, just make sure you get the image very large on screen and move the sliders to get the best result. It's only going to take a couple of minutes. With the spinning round of the screen, you can see I've opened up a different picture. And we're going to take a look at profile corrections, and this is identical whether you're working in Camera Raw or Lightroom. Lens distortion is something that's present in all of the lenses we use in our photography. Much of the time we don't even notice it, which is a good thing, but sometimes we do. Lens distortion that we see in our lenses can be measured. And if it can be measured, then software companies like Adobe can create profile corrections to correct for that known distortion. And that's what we're going to find as the second option within the Optics tab. There we see it, Use Profile Corrections. Now, one of the things you may notice with the image currently on screen is the horizon is slightly tilted, but that's not the real issue. You'll also notice, if you look carefully, that the horizon has almost a smiley face sort of shape. It's tipping up at each end, but because it's tilted as well, it looks like it's tipping up more on the left than the right. Now I've opened up a different image here because it shows exactly the same fault, but it's slightly different. In the previous one, the horizon had a curve, and so does this. But the previous one was tipping up at the left and right edge, whereas this one is curving downwards. Now that's caused by the fact that Here I've got mostly foreground in my shot, and if you look up at the top right you can see I was using a 24mm lens. So I'm using a wide angle lens and I'm tilting downwards. That's likely to cause the curve you can see here. In the other image where we was looking more upwards, then the curve is the other way. Let me bring that other image back on screen. Let's go down to the bottom right of the screen, and I've got a grid here that I can turn on. Now when I turn on the grid, you can quite clearly see over on the right hand side that we've got quite a gap between the trees in the distance and the first line, and far less of a gap on the left hand side. Some of that we could correct by straightening the horizon, tilting the whole image, but not all. So what I'm going to do is just remove that for a moment because the fix is so easy. Much like the chromatic aberration, 99 times out of 100, all we need to do is to tick this box. If you look at the screen as I do so, you'll see it pop, you'll see the curve disappear, but then of course we can always deal with the straightening of the horizon more easily because at least it would be straight. So let's tick the box, and there you see the pop. I'll remove it and we'll just do that once more. And in most cases, that's all we need to do. Now just to the right of the Use Profile Corrections box, we have this little arrowhead, and if we click it, another panel will open up. And if we look at this, we can see that what's happening within Camera Raw is through the information that's recorded with the image, the software knows exactly what lens was used. In this case it was a 16 to 35mm zoom. If you look up at the top around the center of, or the center base of the histogram, you can see it was set at the widest possible 16mm. So here it's applied the profile, and that's what gives us our correction. Now we do get the opportunity to do this in a manual way if we find that the software doesn't pick up the lens we're using. Now I don't think that's very likely these days, but always a possibility I suppose. In that case, come down to the Distortion Slider, because if I move the slider to the extreme right, you can see it does exactly what we was trying to correct a few moments ago. We can now see the horizon dipping down on the right and the left. And if I move the slider to the left, it does the opposite. So if the software didn't identify the lens that was used for our picture, we've got more than enough compensation with this slider alone to put matters right. Now one other slider we have here is the vignette. If we go back to the original little box here and I turn it off, you'll notice that the edges become just a little bit darker, particularly over the right hand side. So if you look just to the right of the tree as I turn this on and off, you can see it makes quite a difference. Now that vignette is actually helping the image. It's quite a good thing to have. So we've got an option here. If we like that effect, but we want to use the profile corrections, then we can come down here and we can put that vignette back. But in practice, I tend not to worry too much about that because I would rather deal with a slight darkening of the edges of my images once I've finished the rest of the manipulations, because then I'm in a better position to judge just by how much I need to do it. Now when we open up an image for the first time, and maybe we open up the optics and we tick to remove chromatic aberration, and if I tick to use the profile corrections with this window already dropped down, you'll notice that the setup is labelled default. But if I were to come down here and move this slider, then it snaps to a custom setting, even if I reset it. And there's another couple of options in there that you can investigate yourself. So if our image editing is made up of a number of small steps, here we have two quite important ones that need to be up there with the first few. Probably chromatic aberration is the more damaging of the two, because sometimes we don't even notice the distortion in our lens, particularly if we don't have any straight edges. Now, it's not only images with a straight horizon where we notice the curve. We can quite clearly see a distinct curve on the building on the right hand side. The other thing we can see is quite a bit of a vignette in the extreme top corner, top right corner and top left corner. So when I go down and tick to use the profile corrections here, it'll straighten the building nicely. It's not going to do anything about my converging verticals. That's a different thing, and we'll be looking at that at some stage. But you can see it's almost got rid of that vignette, and what's left would be easy to eradicate. So I think that just about does it. Two great tools, very easy to use, most of the time fully automatic. I'll see you next time.